Welcome, extraordinary Queen, to yet another thought-provoking and profound coming home conversation brought to you by Makeda Women Leadership. Kathleen, born and bred American Queen, takes us through how her roots may be called home, yet she finds home now where she feels seen, in the unseen communities in Africa. Answering the studio audience's questions led to an astonishing conversation challenging every woman to reflect on what do your origins mean to you. Remember to connect, collaborate, and join the Makeda community. We have lots to chat about. Details are at the end. I'd like to welcome you all to this coming home conversation today. I'll be interviewing Kathleen Rauch, I think I've pronounced it correctly, with Adele, Gilbert, and Wendy, Blair as the studio guests. I'd really like to thank you all so much for joining in this venture that is quite different maybe to anything you've been part of. And I know for some of us, the technology is a bit of a stretch. That includes me. And just for having the courage to show up in a place where with unfamiliar women. I'm truly delighted to have the three of you here today. And I may have said to a few of you that I don't design who's going to be here. I don't try and think, well, this and that person will fit together. I leave it more to the universe to pull that part of the picture together. But what I do like to do is then just see what is the thread that actually connects us. Try and see where there's some synchronicity there. And what's interesting is that today, all of us ladies here are sitting in Johannesburg and actually in not a very far radius from each other. So that's quite extraordinary in itself because it's the first time that that's happening. I know while I was sitting reflecting as we were going into the conversation, the word that came up for today's conversation was origins. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction of you, just by way of how I know you. Wendy, I'll start with you. We've met a couple of years ago. Just the work that you've done in community, your passion project of the Seeds of Light, which really, when I first met you, just sparked huge curiosity in me around the work that you did there with young girls. And then Adele, we've met more recently on one of our, I think we're both adventurers, but one of our adventures not too long ago. And I was also, quite blown away by the pillar of strength and radiance. I know you are in, I can't say precisely because I don't know your CV, but in some echelon of government that has influence and that I'm going to use the word precedent, but sets conditions for for steering some of the way of this country. So welcome to you as well today, Adele. And so on that note, I'd like to invite both of you, whoever's ready to speak, but just to let us know, where you're from, and with the word origins, perhaps just give us an indication of, while we're here in Johannesburg, what are your origins, and what might be interesting for us to know about your origins.
Yes, so actually my origins, I was just thinking how, we're all from sort of different parts of the world. I was born in Scotland, moved to South Africa when I was 9, so I've been grown up in South Africa, basically, and so now living in Johannesburg, but for 12 years previous to, I've been in Johannesburg for about 3 years, but before that was living 12 years in Hoedspruit up in the Limpopo province, and that's where I was involved with community work and also working in local government hospital in that area, and just loved the community work. My passion in that regard was teenagers, and particularly girls, and the kind of resources open to the teenagers in the rural areas is very was very low, and there was just really sort of very little opportunities for the kids. So it was just about trying to work out what kind of opportunities and what could we do to help the children, have given them some hope for their futures, and basically just to sort of give them skills in order to be a sort of a successful adult. That was sort of one of my passions, but we had lots of different ways of doing that with art and teaching and scouting and a whole lot of other things, but that's really sort of where my passion. Finding myself back in Johannesburg, I am a doctor, pathologist, and I'm working as a pathologist in Johannesburg and not doing community work like I'd hoped to, but you know, there's a time and place for everything, and this feels like where I need to be right now. So that's really a little bit of a short history.
Yeah, thanks Wendy.
So my origin essentially is Cape Town, and I'm born and bred from Cape Town, and lived most of my life there until I suppose I decided it was time to do something that was a little bit closer to, I think, what I wanted to do, which was to have more of an impact on what happens in our country and the direction that our country takes, and just contributing more to that. And so I take a step back in that I worked most of my life in the private sector, in terms of auditing or legal firms or those types of things. And I had this strong calling that I really wanted to work in government, and I wanted to particularly work in local government, because I wanted to feel that I was closer to working with the actual people of this country, and working on projects that actually would make a difference in people's lives. And so I stepped out of the private sector and went into the public sector, which was it was certainly a tall mountain to climb. It was probably my Kilimanjaro that I was climbing, because it was a huge learning curve for me. But it did take me closer to actually working with people and trying to make a difference in South Africa. And so now I live in Johannesburg, and that's been a huge change and challenge for me the last 9 years, I would say. But it's also been, in a way, a bit of finding a truer, I would say, South Africa, basically, and a truer sense of myself. So yeah, I've also traveled a lot internationally, and I love that and I enjoy that, because I think it's a wonderful way to understand more of yourself and your own country when you travel, in fact, by getting to see other cultures and how others exist and live. It certainly opens your eyes up to what you have. So that's a bit about me.
Oh, thank you, Adele. Yeah, beautiful. And to hear that your origins are in the Cape, and Wendy all the way out there in Scotland. So I'm just in my mind drawing these lines now down to the Cape and to Cape Town, and another line across to Scotland, and saying, well, look at what we've got already now, you know. And with myself originating in Spain, of course, so we could take another line there as well. So Kathleen, welcome, and it's just such a real privilege to have you here today as our guest interviewee. And I think the conversation, as we all know, is on coming home. But I want to just acknowledge you first by way of introduction. The sense what you've brought into my life, in terms of the person you are, is that of, you know, this whirlwind, is what comes to mind, a whirlwind that enters and leaves with bright, beautiful blue eyes and a happy demeanor at the center of the storm. And I don't know whether that resonates at all with you, but that is those are the words that come to me when I think of how to describe you in this moment. And so on that note, I'm just going to ask you, Wendy and Adele, to switch off your cameras and welcome you, Kathleen, to this coming home conversation. Thank you for being here.
It's so lovely to be here in Johannesburg. It's so lovely to be part of the conversation. I am feeling very much at home. So thank you. Thank you for being so welcoming and for keeping such a nice structure. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. And Kathleen, I must say, just hearing a bit about your story, which we won't necessarily go into all today, there is quite an extraordinary sense of what home is for you. And maybe I think I'm going to invite you to just start, first of all, letting us know where your origin is and how that links to where you are now in terms of home.
Well, it's interesting because I grew up in Seattle, so I consider Seattle, Washington to be my home. Although I wasn't born there, I was born across the United States in Pittsburgh. And as I reflect on the Tennessee piece, my mother's family came to America early on in the history of colonization of America and would have ended up in that Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri area. So I come from a line of people who made spirits and made alcohol. So Kentucky bourbon, Tennessee, all of that. So in fact, the putting Tennessee into where I'm from is actually an ancestral piece for me. And then in terms of homecoming, I think the thing that's interesting is that at this point in my life, I'm actually quite transient. So I've been in Johannesburg for about 6 weeks. I'll be here for another 6 weeks. I'm not sure what happens after that. I've spent the past 3.5, almost 4 years in Hoedspruit, which is where I did have the privilege of meeting Wendy all those years ago. And I came to Africa to be a carer for my spiritual teacher, a woman named Leslie Temple Thurston, who had been living in America in Santa Fe and then developed memory loss and came to South Africa, returned home for a better quality of life. And I followed her here after she'd been here for about a year and came to be a care provider for her. And through Leslie's spiritual teachings, I think my sense of home really shifted from a physical place to a much more internal place. So for me, the idea of coming home, although there is a quality of physicality, when I go back to Seattle and I stay in my childhood bedroom in my 91-year-old mother's home, there's a sense of home. But what gives me peace in my being in the world is that through the training with my spiritual teacher, I've come to find that place of home that resides within me.
That's so beautiful. And the going back, the fact that you still have, my goodness, and I think you mentioned to me that today would be your mother's 91st birthday. So let's celebrate that in this conversation, a beautiful way to honor her as well. And you spoke of, while I just think you're extraordinary in the way you navigate and have navigated your life, but that childhood home in Seattle, you spoke of a certain nostalgia associated with it, while it's not necessarily your home any longer, and how the nature and that surrounds, particularly the blackberries, there's something around the nostalgia, and maybe you want to amplify a little bit around that.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for remembering the blackberries. Because when I return to Seattle, as soon as I step off the train or the airplane or however I've arrived, it's the plant community that really welcomes me. And that's my connection with nature. That's so much what makes me feel like I'm home, that I'm being greeted by my companions and my friends. And blackberry in particular, as you and I spoke about, is really a plant of manifestation. That it starts with a singular stalk, with a singular root base, and then just spreads out, and it covers and it grows and it creeps and it takes over. And it really is a plant both of manifestation and with that manifestation of generosity, because it produces the flowers, it produces, you know, the flowers, the insects and the birds, and then the fruit that feeds the birds and the animals and the people and the insects.
It's amazing how, you know, nature, it seems that nature has become where you find your home, and also the manifestation. I think that's another theme that's coming through, I think is very relevant in the conversation today. What was interesting was I had a question around, you know, what brings you or brought you to Africa of all places? And I know there was obviously some history with, you spoke of the woman Leslie and your spiritual mentor in the US. But I think there's a deeper level of what drew you to here, to South Africa, to Africa.
You know, it's that Africa is the place of humanity, of where humanity came out, where this, you know, this incredible species developed. And it's interesting being here in Johannesburg because, you know, there's the Origins Museum at Wits University. And then in the Cradle of Mankind, you know, to the north of the city, there is such a sense of the original. And so for me, coming to Africa really feels like it's an opportunity for me to come home to this ancient lineage of being a human being. And I find, you know, that I have all of these attunements that as a very sensitive human being growing up in America, I grew up with these longings, I grew up with these awarenesses, but I wasn't necessarily supported or held in my sensitivities. I wasn't acknowledged in those sensitivities. That sometimes knowing things without knowing how I knew them was not comfortable for the people around me. Whereas I find that being in Africa, that there are subtler attunements that are acknowledged. And not only the attunements, the sensitivities, the awarenesses, but also just the simple fact of being a human being. So that I find, as I'm careening wildly through the entire city and suburbs of Johannesburg by bicycle, that as I weave and careen my way through, that there's so much interaction and connection. And that for me, I find here in South Africa, as I found when I was in Kenya as well, that it's very, very easy to make a human connection here. A smile. Hey, mommy, go mommy. You know, my guys at the robot, like the jugglers at the robot where I stay, you know, they all know me. And there's a quality of joy that is available to me here in Africa that sets me a little bit apart in America. It might set me apart here also, but I feel very welcomed with it.
That's beautiful. I think the words I recall you using were a place to come and meet myself.
Yes, South Africa is a very complex place. And so it allows me to meet those complex parts of me that may not be as well met in the Western world that I grew up in.
And it seems also particularly the path that you've chosen to take here, because you don't find an average white person just getting around on their bicycle. Yes, there will obviously be a few people who do that, but it's a courageous thing as well to do. So to some extent, you're meeting a deeper level than a lot of the people here meet. And you've spoke about how you feel seen, you are seen here in this country, and particularly maybe in the way that you're choosing to live. And how does that relate for you in terms of home, the being seen, and the, you know, how much we're perhaps not seen usually in life?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The being seen, because I think interestingly, I think the place where I feel seen the most particularly in my life at the moment. And I'm so appreciative for this conversation, because this, like you say, this being a platform for the exposure, that I'm less comfortable with this type of exposure. I find this to be met by, educated, articulate women is really a delight, but also is a little frightening for me. Where I feel more comfort in being seen, is on the bicycle with the guy, the young man with his blind father, perhaps, on the street corner, when I've got my phone out, looking at my map, wondering if maybe I'll be robbed because I've got my phone out and I'm stopped and I'm quite vulnerable. But again, it's, hello. And it's, hey, mommy, and asking directions from quite vulnerable, being vulnerable myself, and yet asking for support from vulnerable people. So it's the recyclers riding their carts down the street. It's the guys at the robots. It's that, in a way, being seen by the unseen members. And they're so surprised to see, this 54-year-old white lady just bombing around on a bicycle, acknowledging them. So they oftentimes, are quite shocked when I say hello. And then there's this immediate warmth. It gives me a tremendous sense of security, because I just feel like the people all along the various routes that I take, that there's some acknowledgement that I'm seen and to a degree protected.
Yeah. That's interesting, because there was something that came up around, there was a moment there where I really felt your vulnerability. I mean, I think you were talking about how almost being in this kind of scenario is much more, you feel much more vulnerable. And it's almost like a reverse on the normal psychology, where people would think they'd feel much more vulnerable being on the street on a bicycle. In terms of taking it back to the theme of home, we have this notion of that home has to be a physical place, and you have to stick around in one place, or at least have a place that you go back to that you call home. And yet you have such a free spirit that you've spoken about how that isn't really what it is to you. And I think some of the words that you used is that home is a place of friendship, where you find friendship, contemplation, food, physicality. All those things are what give you the resonance of home rather than a physical location. So yeah, if you could maybe speak of the vulnerability that brings up for other people, if you've got a view on that.
I think there's the question of what are you going to do next, and when are you going to settle down? Although I've had certainly periods of being settled in my life, and I'm coming out of that nearly 4-year period of being settled. So I'm just now opening up and giving myself a gap year or a sabbatical year to see where I land or what happens next. But I've certainly had places and eras of my life where I've had a home and been settled. But, in my current open-endedness of not knowing what comes next, specifically with my mother, when are you going to settle down, and what's your next step? And for other people as well, because, my possessions all fit into a tiny car at this point. And most of that is gear. It's climbing gear, it's camping gear, it's my bicycles, my actual possessions that I own that are personal, including my clothes, would fit into a duffel bag. Wow. I think I have 6 pairs of shoes. I have 4 pairs of pants. Things are easy. I grew up with privilege. So for me, things are easy. You can go to any charity shop and things are easy. Stuff is easy. But for me, it's really the experiences. And so as I prioritize experiences over things, although I love nice things, I love nice sheets, I love quality. But as I prioritize experiences over things, that can also trigger people into their own self-judgment and their own fear. What if I had to give up my things? Or are you judging me because I find safety and security in the material world?
Beautiful. Thank you, Kathleen. I mean, I love that, because a big theme as well, I think, today is that of, and which I've heard you speak of before is that contrast between like the physical, the material, rather and the experiential or the more intangible, which I think is something that you really, you truly embody. On that note, I'm going to invite the other ladies. Thank you for sharing, and invite the other ladies, Wendy and Adele, to switch on their cameras again. Welcome back, Adele, Wendy.
Hi.
Hi. And I'd like to just invite you, as you've witnessed the conversation with Kathleen. If there are any questions that you've got or anything, you'd like to say to her around what she's shared, you're welcome to go ahead.
I think, Adele, it's your turn to go first.
No problem. Firstly, to say thank you very much for what you have shared. I think there's so much in what you've said that resonates with me, actually. And a few things that I just wanted to highlight two things. One, so I also have a 91-year-old mother.
Oh.
Which is something that I think is very special at this stage in one's life. And secondly, the very first time that I traveled, that I got on a plane and went abroad, I traveled to Seattle. And I lived there for a year with a friend of mine.
Wow.
And so, yeah, there are some very interesting connections for me when I heard you talking about that and mentioning that. So we can definitely draw some additional lines, I think, in terms of connectivity. One of the things that I actually wanted to ask you is, I found this concept of being seen very interesting. And I wanted to ask you if, when you feel seen by others, by these almost unseen people, does it not in a way almost force you to start seeing yourself more authentically? And isn't that almost the scary part of it?
Yeah, it is, being seen by the people who are vulnerable in the community and building that sense of trust, because there is a trust that happens. There is a camaraderie that we're out here, for our own reasons in the heat or the rain or the difficult conditions, and we're navigating traffic and cars all around us, and it's not particularly safe for any of us, and there's an exchange there. Does that help me see myself more? I like who I am when I'm seeing the unseen. I really like that. I like the stories. I like the shared humanity, but I also like the shared humanity that comes from the basics, that we all need to eat, that we all, how are we meeting our needs? But I'd say probably the primary place that I find where I can see myself is through my contemplative practice. So that every morning I get up and I, based on the artist way that I did 26 years ago, I do my 3 pages of writing every morning. And I think the continuity of that, and I think I still have blind spots. I know I have blind spots, significant ones, like the terror that I have of being seen on this call. I was not aware that I would be so frightened. So that'll be something for me to take to the pages. But where I feel most seen by myself, I think, is in the writing and in that daily practice of just showing up on that blank page every day, day after day, especially on the days that I don't want to.
That's a beautiful way to meet yourself, the writing practice. And I know at the moment it's being highly encouraged to journal and to write. Thank you for sharing. Wendy, is there anything you'd like to bring up with Kathleen?
One of the things I wanted to say was that I think we in South Africa take for granted the friendliness and the openness of the of our people, and that when you do travel, you do realize that people in other countries can be very closed, and I think living here, we underestimate, we take it for granted the people in South Africa, and it's really nice to have somebody who's able to point it out to us, and remind us what a wonderful country we're living in, and the wonderful people that we have in the country that we're living in. And we've traveled a lot as a family, and one of the things that we often say, or particularly my husband often mentions, is that when you are traveling, you feel invisible in other countries because people ignore you and you don't feel seen. And I think it's really, really amazing that Kathleen coming into this country and actually feeling seen, and it's true. I mean, we just have amazing people, and people are very open, and I think we don't realize how different other places are.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, realization, and there's something quite powerful, I think, in contrasting the seen with the unseen, even in a greater way, that so much of what is happening actually is unseen, and how can we make the invisible more visible, so to speak. So I love that that's come up as a theme in this conversation.
If I can just add to that, I think it's really beautiful to hear that, because I think it is something we take for granted. I know that whenever I've been away from South Africa, whenever I fly back, and particularly I think when I've flown into Cape Town, I've always been, and I don't know why it is, but I've always been moved to absolute tears when I fly back into Cape Town after having been away. It just truly does feel, it's that place that I have so much resonance with. And even now, when I go home to Cape Town, the place where I have where I feel most at peace and most myself, I would say, is when I'm close to the sea. And so any place generally where I'm close to the sea, I feel totally at home, basically. And the world feels like a good place when I'm close to the sea. It just reminds me of, I think there is a certain warmth in this country and its people that is just inherent to us, and we don't even realize that we have it.
Thank you for that, Adele. It's quite extraordinary. I think that Cape Point, it came to my realization recently when I was down there, and I'm not a regular traveler, have not been until now a regular traveler to Cape Town, that actually, like the flora in the southern tip of the Cape, most of the floral, around the world stems from that particular region, because during the Ice Age, the tip of Africa was that very tip was the only place where plants survived. So much of the flora comes from there. We're going to start wrapping up a little bit now. And so I think, Wendy, Adele, if there's an acknowledgement you'd like to, a short acknowledgement you'd like to give Kathleen, if anything comes to mind.
Well, just to say how difficult it is to open up in this kind of forum, and thank you for that. And it's a really great acknowledgement for what we have in our country.
Thank you, and just thank you from my side for just the openness that you've shown to share with the camera on. It is appreciated, and to not just touch on superficial things, but to actually really share of yourself. And I actually take my hat off to you that you are a cyclist in Gauteng. I really I think you are a brave woman. And in fact, I look forward to seeing you out on the roads. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And Kathleen, yeah, if you'd like to also just have a last word as well.
Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time on a Sunday afternoon to prioritize this conversation. And thank you, Guiomar, for creating the structure, for bringing us together. I do think that as women, to be able to do this and to have the vulnerability, but also this incredible depth and wisdom, that to make the priority to do this today has made a huge impact on my life. And, you know, and thank you for providing me an opportunity to be seen and to really, in a very safe way, to experience that. Because it's really a gift for me. And it's, you know, it's a treasure that I will carry with me, and I hope to grow my capacity to be seen in this kind of way. So thank you. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Kathleen, just for being prepared to show up and be vulnerable. And I'd like to just close on some of your words that you've shared. You've spent years coming home to your own center, and the wisdom that you shared around be yourself, because everyone else is taken. On that note, we're going to close the circle. The circle's a very powerful thing. And just to say that these conversations, I host them as part of something known as the Makeda organization, which I started. It's still very much an ethereal form. It's still gaining momentum and manifestation. And then just to let you know, yeah, I'm going to play out with a song. It's called Home, and it's by a South African artist called, I think, Kyle Deutsch. I know very little about him, but when I heard this song, as I was starting these series, I found it so uplifting. I don't know what his intention was behind it, but to me, it's a love song, upbeat, and I like to play out with it because it reminds us that we find home by reconnecting with ourselves and by falling in love again with our own selves, and of course with each other here.
Sorry, before you start, if I can just say thank you very much for today. It was really a wonderful experience, and I appreciate the sharing that has taken place today. Thank you so much. And sorry, lovely to meet you both.
No doubt we will still find some form of connection, and so everyone's welcome to say goodbye. So goodbye.